Good afternoon. I have the privilege to return to our conversation with His Eminence Archbishop Lazar Puhalo, who is the founder of the All Saints Monastery in British Columbia and an author, writer, and spiritual guide. Today we are going to continue exploring the topic of marriage. So this is marriage part 2. Good afternoon, Your Eminence.
Good afternoon. Bonsoir.
Bonsoir. Merci. Truly Canadian in both languages. We left the conversation around the concept that marriage is a growth proposition, a relationship with Jesus Christ. Marriage is a calling. You reminded us, or you taught us, and there is that complex process around the growth, which is a 5 years mark, evolving from the physical attraction to something deeper. And you also compared with the other, especially the Protestants, where marriage is not recognized in the Orthodoxy only by civil authority with the prayer of sanctification. What else would you like to discuss today about marriage from that initial conversation?
Well, you can't really talk about marriage, particularly in our era, without talking about divorce as well. Just go back a minute. For so many people in their minds nowadays, especially younger generations, formal marriage is simply a license to have sex. And nothing really more. But we discussed already the depth of the Orthodox Christian theology and the divine service for the crowning of a marriage. Sometimes, though, a divorce happens. You can howl at the wind all day about why it shouldn't happen, but it does happen. So let's not pretend that we don't need a solution for when a marriage does break down and end. Sometimes divorce is necessary. I realize there are various religious or even Christian cults that think a woman should endure every manner of abuse from her husband, physically and emotionally, and watch him destroy her children, but she shouldn't never get a divorce. That's not only irrational, but not even moral. So sometimes a divorce becomes necessary. Sometimes it's not really necessary. People just get tired of each other. They're not happy anymore. But there are times when a divorce is absolutely necessary. Sometimes the marriage is destroying one or even both husband and wife, and sometimes destroying the children. I know one instance where a man, Romanian man, came home every night inebriated, and he would break up the furniture, slap his wife around, and physically abuse his children. Anyone who says that the women have to remain in that kind of a marriage and not divorce is immoral. To think that. But there's a difference. I want to point the difference between the approach and I'll say in the Latin Church, because there are dozens of Protestant denominations, and I don't think they have a particularly liturgical involvement, or a clerical involvement in a divorce, aside from trying to advise the couples about their marriage. But sometimes a divorce is absolutely necessary. People get a civil divorce because all marriages are civil marriages as well as ecclesiastical marriages. And once they get that divorce and are no longer living together, if they need to get married again, and there are various reasons why it's an imperative, then they ask for a canonical divorce from the church marriage, from the bishop. Now, the bishop is going to grant that canonical divorce so that the person who gets the canonical divorce can remarry in the church. In order to get that divorce in the West, in the Latin Church, one has to apply to the Vatican. Perhaps the local cardinal actually does the work, but you're applying to the Vatican for an annulment of your previous marriage. And that's just a legal fiction, because a marriage that's been consummated cannot be annulled. It requires a divorce. But since some canons, they forbid divorce completely, they have to have a legal fiction for why they give a divorce anyway. So they call it an annulment. It's still a divorce, but it's covered by a legal fiction that it's not a divorce.
Because it would conflict with the other part of the theology that
Yeah, well, just strictly that
deny divorce
is forbidden.
Right.
And therefore you give an annulment, and it is a divorce, but you're pretending that it's not under a legal fiction.
However, in the Orthodox Church, divorce can be granted.
Yeah, the bishop can grant a canonical divorce.
How did the Eastern Church overcome, that the divorce being forbidden? How did
Well, I don't know if the divorce is actually forbidden. I mean, Christ wants to make marriage eternal, and says, well, Moses told you give a right of divorce, but that was because of the hardness of your hearts. But no, he doesn't say that a woman has to stay in a marriage no matter how she's being abused, raped, slapped around, or her children are being abused and destroyed by her husband. You know, a husband might take up cocaine or heroin, and the money that should be spent on food for the children is being spent on narcotics. It would be absolutely immoral to suggest that a woman remain in such a marriage. Anyway, the ecclesiastical divorce is granted. Now, in the West, a divorced person cannot receive communion in the church, and they cannot remarry unless they get this annulment type of divorce. And I'm not sure how they handle a divorced and remarried person, but a divorced person can't receive communion. In the Orthodox Church, there was a little bit more humanity. And we see it in so many ways that the Orthodox Church has been attuned to human psychology and attuned to the human needs of individuals, not expecting them to be angels or angelic or bodiless somehow. So you get a second marriage by economia, as we call it. The economia is the secret. The Orthodox Church practices economia, that is, instead of strictness of the law, you say, oh, okay, the law is valid, but for this or that reason, we're going to relax the strictness of the law and allow something to happen anyway. So they come and get married a second time in the church, but it's not a crowning this time. It's a little bit of a fairly short service. You don't have the fullness of this, where you're making these commitments and coming with each other. So that is really, in a way, to fulfill Apostle Paul's words that better to marry than to burn. But also, we're realizing that in the case of a total breakdown of a marriage, a woman might be raising 3 or 4 children by herself, and she wants to provide a father for her children. On the other hand, a man might end up with custody of the children. He wants to provide a mother for his children. So the remarriage is not seen as just an act of the passions in that case, but the need to provide the fullness of the family for your children. Also companionship, because marriage isn't all about sex, even though we are, the Christian church is absolutely almost psychiatrically obsessed with sex. Remarriage is also about companionship. And when a young couple gets divorced, it's irrational to expect somebody, say their 20s or 30s, to live till their 80s without any kind of sexual relations or any kind of companionship or intimacy. Intimacy is about much more than just the passions. So the church provides for remarriage for the sake of the weakness of our human nature, but to give us the opportunity to have our intimacy within the framework of marriage itself, within the framework of some kind of sanctified unity. So the church provides for that canonical divorce and a remarriage. And as a matter of fact, you can get married a third time. It's more or less a blessing. It's not much of a ceremony. It's kind of cold.
It'd be crazy now.
But still, it's an economia, because you can't expect a couple, especially a young couple, to remain celibate all their life. Some people might want to take on that struggle, but you can't force it on people, because it might be beyond their strength as human beings. So you want to give them a sanctified situation, somehow to live their lives and have their intimacies in. After the third time, if you're a 3-time loser, you might as well become a monk. But because if you're a 3-time loser, you might be the cause of the divorces. You might be the protagonist in the story. So after that, of course, you're kind of on your own.
Is there
but there is that economia, that act of mercy and compassion, and understanding of the human nature.
Is there a ritual for people who separate?
No, there's not an actual ritual for it. There's just a canonical divorce.
Just an administrative document?
An administrative document. So they can, even if they were in a different city, they could show the canonical divorce and the civil divorce papers and get married again.
And coming back to the marriage itself, hopefully not with the divorce attached to it.
Hopefully.
In Orthodoxy, in Eastern Orthodoxy, priests and bishops bishops and metropolitans can be married?
The priest should be married, unless they're monastic.
And the bishops?
No, not since probably the 3rd century.
What justified that change in the doctrine?
It's rather debatable, because several reasons are given. That just as why priests are celibate in the Latin Church, in the Western Rite Latin Church, not in the Eastern Rite Catholic Church. So in that respect, it cannot be a doctrine. Celibate priest cannot be a doctrine in the Catholic Church, because Eastern Rite Catholic priests are married. And if it was a doctrine, they couldn't be. So it's a practice in the Western Church that people cling to it in a way that, like the previous Pope wanted to let some of the priests along the Amazon get married, because, they're in this isolated place in these tribal positions, and a lot of the Catholic priests in Africa have common law marriages and families, because it's unnatural for people not to want a family and not to want the companionship of marriage. Also, the passions are there, and they're difficult to control in these primitive situations, or even in certain cultures where celibacy is viewed as sort of unnatural, like as in Africa. But the cardinals, the conservatives in the church, were dead set against it. Now, the argument had been that if the priest was married, he would have children, they would inherit church property somehow. I don't see how that was possible, but anyway, that they could alienate some of the church property, the offspring. But that certainly is not true in our modern era. There's no way your descendants can alienate any kind of church property. So if that's the reason for celibacy of clergy, then the reason has vanished and there's no excuse for it anymore. If they're remaining celibate because Augustine said that marriage was a venial sin, cloaked in the guise of respectability for the sake of procreation, then they could say, well, we don't want the priest living in venial sin. You know, if they're going to, it better they live in actual sin by having a mistress or a housekeeper or children out of wedlock, which, of course, as we know, happens massively in some countries. So there's no excuse for celibate clergy, but the reason why it became that bishops and beyond remained celibate is because they wanted to choose the hierarchs from among the monastics who they thought were more spiritually developed. That, of course, has all kinds of holes in it too, because many of the bishops we have nowadays have never seen the inside of a monastery up close. They may have gone on a pilgrimage or visited one, but they never lived in one. That's why some places you have archimandrite serving as parish priest, but archimandrite is really a candidate for the bishop. And he's going to remain celibate so he can become a bishop. Now that's a better career than teaching school, and in some cases pays a great deal more. And I'm going to say that very often these people are totally sincere and render their service properly, but the excuse or the reason doesn't seem to apply anymore. Doesn't seem to be there anymore. But that's another story. That's for another ecumenical council would have to resolve that. But the fact that a layperson can get a canonical divorce and remarry, even up to twice, is really an exorcism in economia, where you release the strictness of the law for the sake of the person's salvation.
Mm-hmm.
That's why instead of baptizing some converts who have been baptized, the practice most places is to chrismate them and not do a full baptism. And that's an economia too, to facilitate somebody's salvation by bringing them into the church in a way that is simpler and easier. And some people are too old, or you don't have a place big enough to baptize them or something. But these economias are acts of condescension and love, mercy. They can't replace the law that's being, you say you have the strictness of the rule, but you practice economia. Economia doesn't change the rule. It just shows mercy and compassion in the fulfillment of the law, of the rule. And it's usually done to facilitate the salvation of the person. Mm-hmm. That's why remarriage is an economia to facilitate the salvation of the person, to give them still a church-blessed union to fulfill their lives within, instead of having them have to fulfill their lives outside of a sanctified union, mm-hmm. outside of a marriage. So understanding the weakness of our human nature, there's some economias like this, some compassion and merciful condescension takes place. Doesn't change the law, but it softens it for the sake of someone's salvation.
So then you understand, if a priest would like to, a married priest would like to become a bishop?
Yeah. Well, he could always poison his wife, or I think if he got a divorce from his wife, he wouldn't be a candidate for bishop anymore.
Right, so that's not the path.
No, there have been several widowed priests whose wives have passed away who have become bishops.
Oh, that's possible.
Yeah,
right.
the Ukrainian Metropolitan of Canada, Vasilia, was a widow.
Yeah.
And he became a bishop afterward.
Yeah. Is that a barrier in your mind to maybe vocations that cannot be fulfilled because of that reason, or?
Well, I suspect so. There's one thing that I think is wholly unjust, and I even think it's a misunderstanding of Scripture. When in the epistles it says to let the presbyter be the husband of one wife, I think he really meant only one at a time. I mean, it was possible in many cultures at the time to have 2, 3, or 4 wives, and I think he was saying, no, a person who has more than one wife should never be a priest. But it's been taken as saying, if a priest's wife dies, he cannot remarry unless he leaves the priesthood. And some very good, sound, solid, decent, excellent priests have had to leave the priesthood to marry again. If, in the case of a wife might die and leave her husband with 3 or 4 small children, or some age, and he wants to provide a mother for the children. He's not getting married out of sheer passions. He wants to find a woman he can love so that they can give the children a full family and provide a mother for his children, and also companionship for himself, because it's extremely difficult for a young man to live without that companionship, and difficult to raise children without a mother. You can say, oh, Sophia will come and look after the children while I'm serving in church, or I can get some ladies will volunteer, or my mother will raise the children, or daycare will take care of most of the time and just have them just in the evening. But that's not a substitute for having a mother. It's not a substitute for having a father and mother both in a family.
What does it take to let's say there is a consensus around your approach, Your Eminence.
Yeah.
What would it take for those rules to change?
Well, apparently the ecumenical patriarch has just shown economia in this case, and let a serving priest remarry without losing his priesthood. Now, to me, that's a marvelous breakthrough that was long overdue. And I'm hoping it's going to then become practice, not just an exception.
Will it be the same process for bishops to be able to be married?
No bishops.
What would that take?
An ecumenical council.
What's the likelihood of those type of?
I don't think it'll ever happen.
Because?
No, nobody would see any reason for it.
You seem to.
I mean, actually, I think some of the bishops would be more healthy if they were married.
Right.
I mean, I'm in favor of married bishops.
Yeah.
But that's just a personal view. To change that would take an ecumenical council.
And that's not.
Well, some things that are based on the epistle to Timothy, which look absolutely misogynistic and like sex was a disease instead of a normal human function. Of course, the epistle to Timothy was not written by Apostle Paul, and we know that. We're quite certain that it wasn't written by Paul, any more than the epistle to the Hebrews was. And there's certain other epistles which likely weren't written by Paul. And, philologists can determine these things easy enough. but the epistle to Timothy. Well, the first clue in the epistle to Timothy. The first clue in the epistle to Timothy is that Titus is that it's organizing the church with presbyters and bishops and deacons, whereas Paul expected the world to come to an end in his own lifetime. So what reason would there be to organize the church as if it was going to continue into the far future, if the world was going to come to an end in any time now, within the next, say, 30 years or so? And if Paul appears to believe that quite strongly, so he wouldn't have had an impetus to give an organization to the church. The second thing is that I don't see that Paul was a misogynist, because he ordained Phoebe to the diaconate. He had women who supported him. He called one woman an apostle, indeed. And if the story of Thecla, if it is true, he certainly didn't condemn or curse Thecla. So I don't see Paul as a misogynist, although the epistle to Timothy and one kind of what looks like an interpolation into Corinthians, and not actually from Paul, sounds very misogynistic, like almost a hatred of women, but that just doesn't seem to me to be a characteristic of Paul. But anyway, the experts have ways and means of determining these things with a fair degree of certainty and accuracy, assure us that the epistle to Timothy wasn't written by Paul. Maybe a presbyter ordained by Paul, but not by Paul. So anyway, that we have to look at the reasons we have for certain practices in the church, which may have applied in earlier times. For example, perhaps there was a time in the history of the Roman Catholic Church when the children of a priest might inherit the church or the parish house or some church property. That might have been the case. It isn't the case now, so you have to come up with a new reason for celibacy of clergy. And Ireland is an example of why there shall not be celibate clergy.
Mm-hmm.
That's anyway, the principle of economy is what we wanted to show in marriage, the mercy and compassion that makes us condescend to soften the application of the law.
However,
For some people's salvation.
there are limits to the applicability of the principle of economia on the issue of marriage of bishops. That would not be enough.
No, that would take an ecumenical council.
What determines?
I mean, who could determine to exercise that kind of economy unless they hold? One patriarch can't do that himself.
For what's the rule here?
It would take the Congress of the church to do that.
Because what's the criteria when it takes the Congress versus when it just takes the patriarch?
Well, it's something that's canonical in the canon, and it's agreed throughout the church. You have the economy of remarriage, and the church has a service for the second or third marriage, and also the chastisement for multiple divorces. But something that's set by canons or canonical in the church, it takes an ecumenical council to actually change the principle. Now, supposing the Carpathal Russian Orthodox Church decided to let bishops get married, and the rest of the church didn't, then the Carpathal Russian Church would no longer be in communion with the rest of the church. There was a broken communion.
Yeah. On the canonical is really the criteria here.
Yeah, then they would simply be, well, for want of a better expression, disfellowshipped from the body of the church.
Mm-hmm. When is the last time the ecumenical council gathered to take a decision on canon?
Well, we usually think about the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and I honestly can't remember the year right now, 700s. But they decided about the veneration of icons and the fact that the incarnation was real, not a fiction.
The year 700s?
Well, a lot of times people miss one of the points of the Seventh Ecumenical Council. It restored the veneration of icons and certified the veneration of icons, but when, some people have tried to do away with icons in the church. But the part of it that's often missed is we have icons of Christ because he appeared in the flesh. There were people that said he didn't appear in the flesh, that he was a spiritual image that was seen, or even that the crucifixion was something that took place in the heavens, in the heavenly realms. There were all kinds of stories, that the adoptionist and the Gnostic idea that Christ was a manifestation of some kind, but not a physical body. And so, in saying that you can render icons of Christ because he appeared in the flesh, but you should not have icons of God the Father and the Holy Spirit because neither of them appeared in the flesh. In fact, the Council of the Tower says that you shouldn't historiate the Holy Spirit as a bird, except at the baptism of Christ, theophany, but no other time. And God the Father should never be portrayed because he's never been seen by anyone at any time. Even Moses on Mount Sinai saw an image from the back.
So there has not been...
But not God face to face.
So is that correct? Sorry, is that correct to say that there has not been an ecumenical council on matters of canons since the 700s?
Well, I would say that the Palamite councils, what were the 1400s? Anyway, the Palamite councils probably, if they had another general council, they would probably decide that the Palamite councils had been an eighth ecumenical council, because it really was, but it wasn't called by the emperor or anything, and didn't have the characteristics of an ecumenical council.
Mm-hmm.
And like the bishops from around the world were called to attend, but it probably should be classified as an ecumenical council because of the things that ruled on, the questions that it took up.
So it's pretty rare. I mean, rare is an understatement that you have the need, that there's a need for an ecumenical council on canons.
Well, it would be a very rare thing that you would have an ecumenical council. Some reasons might militate against it now, because politics is too involved nowadays. But an ecumenical council could be called. There is I think, fiction that an ecumenical council can only be called by a ruler, by an emperor.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there aren't any Orthodox emperors or kings, so there's nobody to call the ecumenical council. Mm. And if the ecumenical patriarch called the council, not all the other patriarchs would go. They would shun it because of political issues between them and the see of Constantinople. So it would be very difficult to call an ecumenical council now. You had local councils that were canonical, local councils in Iași in Romania in 1905, I think, which actually forbade using the new calendar.
It
wasn't taken that seriously by the people afterward.
If it's difficult to gather a council, does it mean that there is no? Does it mean that there is no? Does it also mean that there is no issues that we would require?
Well, there are issues, but the Council of Moscow, 1667, forbade the painting icons of God the Father, but nobody took that too seriously either. Mm. But now there would be too many political issues. The Patriarch of Constantinople tried to call a general council of the church, a pan-Orthodox council, in Cyprus, but some of the patriarchs refused to participate or to recognize it, even to recognize the council.
To decide on what canons?
You know, they were deciding on church order and disciplines, and some issues about ecology, and there was some hint that ecumenism would be discussed. So there were very great political divisions. The Georgians wouldn't go because Georgians were old calendars, and the Russians wouldn't go because Moscow and Constantinople have been fighting with each other ever since the revolution, and the Serbian church was really not too fond of the ecumenical patriarch. So there were reasons why some, and even if the Greek church participated, some of the Greek bishops were totally opposed to accepting any of his decisions. So it'd be very difficult because of the politics of the day.
So how do you resolve the canonical issues if the politics doesn't allow the decision makers to you know,
well, you
legislate?
know, sometimes issues are resolved on a parish by parish basis, because some parishes realize, well, you know, you can't thrive under this burden. So they themselves in the parish, they resolve the issue the way they feel they need to.
And they have the jurisdiction.
Well, they don't really. I mean, it should be a general council, but sometimes you have to resolve it on each patriarchate has to take decisions for itself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's no canon to enforce the new calendar, and Moscow Patriarchate, the Georgian Patriarchate, Serbian Patriarchate refuses to use the new calendar. Well, actually, the revised Julian calendar is what it is, really is. But so you can't have a canon. You can't require everyone to use the new calendar. Even the Council of Yash using the new calendar was forbidden by General Council, but people did it anyway. Mm-hmm. You know, these local councils, sometimes they're taken with a grain of salt, sometimes they're taken very seriously. But if you want to use canons against somebody, you'll use the most remote and obscure canon from the most obscure local council that you can find, because you want to hurt somebody with the canon or use it as a weapon.
Thank you, Your Eminence.